an early voice for women in the late Renaissance is the nun, Benedictine nun, Arcangela Tarabotti. She would probably not like to be identified as a nun, but that's kind of at the heart of her story. She grew up in a very large family, lots of kids, and she was at a very early age basically forced into a convent to become a nun. Her family apparently judged her to be not marriageable, and they didn't want to have to feed her. She had like 10 brothers and sisters running around, so they forced her into a cloister. A not uncommon route for girls. Whether they wanted to or not, they became nuns. And this was a point of some frustration for a woman like Tarabotti, who, from within the walls of within the habit, she started writing and conversing and writing letters with some of the leading intellects of her day, which was very unusual for any woman, let alone this little nun in Venice. And she she wrote a number of actual books and published materials, and probably her most prominent is one called Paternal Tyranny. And the paternal in there refers to, well, criticism of the power of the father over a daughter. Let's say she obviously felt some hostility towards her own father, whose decision it was to put her in the cloister, but also she expands that a little bit, and she takes on all male authorities, which in early 17th century Italy included the church, the government, society writ large. And she writes this from a place of great frustration, anger at her own situation, but she universalizes it. So it's not just about her problem being in a convent, but about the position, the powerlessness of women across the globe. She doesn't pull a lot of punches. Men's depravity could not have devised a more heinous crime than the wanton defiance of God's inviolable decrees. She claims God is on her side, and she lays out a very specific argument to show that the practice of negating the free will of women, half of the population of the planet, is in opposition to God's will. This is taking on the church, but it's doing so by arguing on their grounds. She's not afraid to take the fight to them. She, let's see, she attacks the idea of being forced into being a nun by taking it on as a kind of perversion of the process, saying that nuns should be called. Nuns should feel the divine inspiration to pursue that calling, and to negate that, to force someone into it who does not have that calling, is thus a violation of God's will, because if God controls everything, God controls who is called. And if you try and force someone in who has not heard that call, then you are working against God. And she asserts the right to determine whether or not she hears that call. And she does it in surprisingly aggressive ways, surprisingly assertive ways. I would be willing to pour out blood as well as ink if it meant that cloistered nuns led a holy life, following the rules of that order to the letter, for the honor and glory of the Catholic faith. Pour out blood as well as ink. A sort of equivalence between blood and ink. Both are seen as kinds of sacraments in her view then. She prefers to work in ink. She demands her ability to write, the dignity of her speech, and her ability to express herself. And she goes on to say, you know, these women who become nuns, they do so for a reason. And she name checks a couple of them, including Teresa of Avila, the Spanish nun, of whom she writes, she made such progress in the religious life that she left volumes of writings in which even the learned are amazed to read by what means the Redeemer led her to perfect holiness. So here she is validating that Teresa of Avila felt a genuine calling and became a nun, and so that is good. So she is validating that decision by Avila. Teresa. But significantly also, she is crediting that, well, because she wrote so much, because she had freedom of expression, we know this about her. We know that she was truly devout and felt called to be a nun. So she is at one point, Tarabotti is at one point arguing that forcing people to be nuns is bad. Allowing people to be called by God is, by contrast, good. And women should be allowed to write and express themselves so that we have a record of these manifestations of divine intervention, shall we say. So she's fighting a couple of fronts here. She's saying, I don't want to be a nun, I shouldn't have to be, and I should definitely be allowed to write and express myself. When she gets a little deeper into the argument, now that she's laid out the predicate that I should be allowed to write, I have freedom of expression, once she lays that out, she can then dig into the argument, and she takes it to, she goes to where authority lies. And in early 17th century Italy, authority lies with two main places in the culture, if you're talking about cultural authority, and that is the Catholic Church, which vests itself in the Bible and the teachings of the Bible, more specifically, but also Italy, Dante. So she cites Dante and Scripture as her justification. Over the gate of hell, Dante says, are inscribed the words, abandon every hope, ye who enter here. Famous sign over the gate, and she says the same could be inscribed over the portals of convents, which is a little shocking. A convent is hell. Well, maybe in this construction. But then she goes and she talks about Genesis, and because if you're talking about free will and if you're talking about the power of man over women, you got to go where the argument is, and that is the story of Adam and Eve. Well, the early story of Genesis. She doesn't go straight to Adam and Eve. She tries to deal with Cain and Abel, and the evidence of their offerings, and how one was sincere and the other supposedly was not. And God could tell the difference and considered it an insult that he was offered something insincere by Cain. And so he regarded Abel and not Cain. Now, this has very sketchy scriptural precedent, to be perfectly honest. There's not a lot of reference specifically to how God thought about the two gifts. It's just that, you know, he liked one and did not like another, and doesn't give an explanation. There's nothing in there about him weighing the sincerity of anything. But put that aside. She is drawing probably more from devotional scripture than from our devotional writings rather than from scripture itself, so give her that. But she takes it to that place, Cain and Abel, and the idea that an offering needs to be sincere, and that when you pervert that process, when you try and force a woman to devote herself to the Catholic vocation of being a nun, you are in effect spitting in the eye of God, because if God wanted that person to be a nun, he would have called her. That's the argument. The specific argument, however, she always brings it back. She will wrestle it back into more personal terms, because there is this constant interplay between the personal, the biblical, the social, the artistic, all of these realms of reality intersect with her. My final point: if murderous Cain slew the living flesh of his own innocent brother because he contradicted and opposed Cain's impious counsel about there being no justice and no judge, no reward for the just, or in another word, and no punishment for the wicked, all again questionable theology, but take that for what it is, male relatives are not so very different. Oh! That's getting personal. And you can see the fury she feels at, I assume, her father and brothers and whomever else in the family was in on that meeting that said, let's just stick her in a convent. The rage that just cannot be quenched in that is bubbling up, but it's doing so within a broader context, so that it's not just personal. It's the rage of women. She's talking about representation. The whole discussion of Cain and Abel it turns on the idea that Abel's sacrifice was genuine because Abel is clearly an early precursor of Christ, and Christ fulfilled the covenant that was Abel, and blah. And so in this, clearly she is dealing with Abel as or Cain and Abel as symbols. And she says very explicitly, Abel is Christ, Cain is Satan, or Lucifer. And so she is dealing on that symbolic level. So she is very comfortable making herself part of the equation as a symbol for women in general, for women in society, for women who want to be nuns, for women who don't want to be nuns, for women who just want to be able to write, women who don't feel that who don't want to have to write. She is comfortable slipping herself into that role and saying, no matter what, we deserve the opportunity to speak. And taking away that right. Sin. It's a sin to rob a woman, any woman, or women in general, of the right to think and speak for themselves.